Grove, work at Netlify, and I'd like to talk to you about teaching GraphQL to actually write code. And that is teaching it to write code for you, for your team, and even for your customer. But first, kind of stepping back and taking a look at the GraphQL tooling landscape as it exists today. It's interesting to kind of compare the application lifecycle development stages and the corresponding GraphQL tooling that we have at those stages. So, for example, initially, whenever you're first kind of exploring a application or building a server or consuming data from a server, we have quite a bit of tooling around that to try to understand the domain and the data model, both that you might offer and what is being offered by a GraphQL server. And then on the dev time side, there's not a ton of tooling out there. This is whenever we have understood the domain and the data model, and we actually have to move that understanding into kind of code, something that we can interact with and explore. Finally, there is the runtime or the production aspect of it, which is where we're actually going to run this code. Maybe clients come in here. This is where we're actually going to be executing the development time resources and consuming that data for real. And it's interesting to see because the ecosystem is actually quite vast. Here's just a snapshot from the Guild, which I believe has two other folks speaking at today's conference. And you can see that they just cover a wide range of various aspects of building a GraphQL server or consuming GraphQL servers. But you can see that they themselves kind of categorize everything around, are you trying to build a server? Are you trying to consume it? So some of their Swift clients down here, for example, or are you trying to kind of explore and see what's available? So both in the schema management tool or schema registry, that sort of thing. And even if we look at, for example, the GraphQL landscape, so this is at landscape.graphql.org, you can kind of scroll around here and see the way that they organize some of their understanding of the landscape. And if we don't maybe pay too much attention to the GraphQL Foundation members and adopters, but we just look at the projects and the tooling that are available. You can see here that we have a lot of repetition. Obviously, the Guild's tooling is very well represented inside of here. Then we have things like the Apollo CLI, Apollo services, AppSync. So services that kind of help you present a GraphQL server or services that help you consume a GraphQL server. And it's kind of interesting that so much effort has gone into, say, for example, the exploration time, around maybe Graphical and GraphQL Playground and those sort of tools, as well as in the runtime. And I would say that it's kind of a natural consequence that, first of all, GraphQL itself is still fairly young, certainly compared to, say, REST or SOAP or WSDL, those sorts of technologies. It's still the new kid on the block in many respects. And it takes a lot of effort to actually go ahead and bootstrap all the different toolings. You actually need tools that allow you to explore what a server has. And GraphQL really excels at that, just from the spec alone. And then after that, you need tools that allow you to consume it and integrate it kind of in that last mile to actually fetch the data at runtime. And then as a consequence of that bootstrapping process, it develops some experts who are very good at their particular domain. And they tend to understand the transitionary steps. Even though they're implicit going from exploration to dev time to runtime, they become kind of embodied. And we just kind of physically know what's necessary to translate from one step to the next. And along with that, like each of these areas goes very deep. If you think about, stellates and whatnot, like you can spend a lot of time going very deep, building a service or building a tool that focuses on just one aspect of the application lifecycle development for GraphQL. But in that process, we tend to miss some of the individual steps. So in particular, the transitions. So the in-between points, whenever we're transitioning from understanding the domain model and the data model into actually implementing the code that's going to consume that. So going from dev to data to dev, transitioning from development into usage. And although it's not the point of this talk, I think it's really important also to understand how we go from usage back to the data stage. And in particular, gathering kind of real world information about how our application or our API is being used and then using that to inform improvements that we can then put into practice for our API. So kind of with that understanding of where the GraphQL tooling is, like why would we want to teach GraphQL to write code in the first place? And I would argue that GraphQL itself, a query embeds a whole lot of knowledge in and of itself. It has its requirements in terms of the fields and the data it needs, the inputs, the variables, oftentimes the intent about how it's probably intended to be used, whether it's supposed to be reading data or writing data or making some effect happen or listening to some event. And it implies knowledge of the possibilities of where this might be used and how it might be used. And so if we can actually build tools that leverage that embedded knowledge, then I think it helps quite a bit with those transitionary points that we mentioned earlier. And the way I kind of look at it, the perspective I look at it is of actually teaching GraphQL to write code. So it's kind of like whenever I have built a GraphQL query, GraphQL already knows so much about what could be possible with this query or mutation or subscription. What if it just went one step further and did all of the necessary requirements for those possibilities? And it's really useful to think of it that way, because if I think about building tools that are, it's going to leverage all that embedded information, it seems like a lot of work. But if I start from the point of view of, GraphQL already encompasses so much of that in just like a single operation, then it doesn't seem so bad to maybe build tooling that helps through those transitionary steps. And, kind of looking at the history of this, it's interesting because we have spent a lot of time, first at OneGraph and now at Netlify Graph, on these specific problems. Our first foray into this is Graphical Explorer. So if you're not familiar with it, so Graphical is a wonderful IDE for interacting with GraphQL servers. It's kind of the main bread and butter of most GraphQL tool sets. And what we found is, especially early on in the GraphQL days, was that whenever people started with a blank slate, they didn't know what to do. They didn't know GraphQL syntax. They didn't know what was on offer. And so we kind of built this tree-like structure over here, where because a GraphQL server offers introspection, it can tell the user, here are all the possibilities. Here's everywhere you could go from here. And then just simply by kind of coming through here and saying, for example, Salesforce, I see Salesforce and opportunities, and I want to get the first 10. And as I kind of click on here, I can see it's actually writing the code for me. So this is kind of the first step where it's actually writing code for me. It's modifying my code. So if I come in here and I get some fields off an opportunity, I can come here and maybe say I want the first 10, and it even knows how to translate these hard-coded numbers where I may not know how to specify arguments, but I see that they're highlighted differently, and I can kind of build an intuition about what's on offer and how to express that in a native GraphQL way, going all the way up to variables. And so at this point, we already have tools that are starting to write our code for us. They read our GraphQL queries, they give us a visual tree, and we can modify that tree, and it updates our code. And I kind of think of this as a form of bridge building for users, where, as we said initially, we sat down users in front of Graphical, and we were really excited about the data that they could get access to. But what we didn't realize is that there was actually this barrier for them to get in, whereby they had to know GraphQL syntax. They had to know variables or arguments. They had to know, the actual syntax. And so that ended up making it basically a non-starter for the vast majority of people that we initially started with. However, because we had gone so deep with GraphQL, we actually were not aware that that was even a barrier. And so Graphical Explorer was kind of our first way of automating that process of saying, hey, look, you don't actually have to figure out how to get across this barrier right now. We'll build you a little bridge over it. And so that kind of opens up a question, which is, what else could we automate? And we wrote a little bit about this a few years back, kind of the GraphQL to app lifecycle. where a user comes in, they don't know the syntax of GraphQL, they don't even know the concepts, and we mentioned kind of how Graphical Explorer was meant to be that first bridge. And it was really exciting to see just kind of the success rate of setting new users down and just kind of asking to kind of click around and describing in human language what data we'd like them to get out, or for them to be able to describe it, and then for them to actually be able to effectively translate that into GraphQL. The thing is, doing that inside of Graphical is one thing. It's a pretty big high to be able to get data out of an API so quickly and so effectively. But then there was this big question of, well, now what? I have it in Graphical, but Graphical is not where I need to get this data. I need to get it inside of my app in some way. And we then found there was a very big drop-off in successful users because it was, again, another really big barrier. And then whenever they went and tried to figure out how to do that, there are lots and lots of tutorials and workshops and lots of clients. And so almost paralysis by choice, just all the different ways that they could go through. They actually had to kind of divorce themselves from the problem that they were thinking about at the moment and move over to this new problem, which is, okay, how do you actually write code that consumes a GraphQL endpoint? And so we wrote an initial tool called Graphical Explorer. And what it would do is actually read your GraphQL query and write some GraphQL, or write some JavaScript code for you, or curl, or bash. And we found that this was quite successful, initially just in making users successful and just getting them over that second barrier. However, what we found after that was also even more important in many ways, which is that we were able to embed a teacher in this tool so that users, for example, many of our users didn't know that you could name GraphQL operations. So in this case, what I've done is I have a little RSS reader, or a set of operations inside of this document, and I've deleted the name for this operation. And in the generated code, we're able to kind of give a helpful hint to the user saying that, hey, maybe giving this query a unique descriptive name is going to be helpful in many ways. Because so often we see just query and then the query selection rather than actually giving it a name. And so in many ways, being able to embed the knowledge that we had gone so deep and built up that was now implicit to us, embedding that into the code generation meant that our users kind of had someone holding their hand each step along the way to make sure that they were actually successful. And that was for the old Graphical 1.0. However, there is already a open pull request to get it merged in the new form in Graphical 2.0, which is looking great. And you can see a preview of that here. So this code exporter is going to be available for users of Graphical 2.0 as well. But there were some really fundamental limitations to this approach. In particular, running in the browser alongside Graphical, we have no access to your source code, your repository, and really just putting out some text. So usually that's, to be really easy, it's just going to be one file, because you're really going to have to copy and paste that into some other, VS Code or Vim or whatever it might be. And ultimately what we found is that kind of doing this in a strictly string-based way was a fairly challenging way of allowing people to customize this. So most of the time, folks would just take our more generic code exporter and kind of live within these constraints, and then copy and paste and then edit the resulting code to actually to suit their needs, rather than writing a custom code generator. Also, I should mention that there's another really much more famous version of this, which is GraphQL Code Generator. This doesn't live inside of Graphical, but they have a great website where you can come in. You can paste in your schema, and if you paste in a query that conforms to that schema, so if I come in here, you can see that I get out actually this set of types that actually matches exactly what I'm looking for. As you can see here, I have ID, content, time, scalars. So the Guild's GraphQL code generator, it really focuses on taking a schema and an operation and giving you some type-safe representation of the data that operation is going to return. So now we've had some time to sit back and interact with some of our users and also go very deep on using the CodeGen ourselves for a couple of years now. And as we've seen building bridges become these ways of bypassing barriers for both new users and automating the painful parts for experienced users, we thought it would be really nice if we could find a way to really widen that bridge and really speed up progress through it. So here's an example of a enhanced version of that code generator. And this one actually interacts not only with your code inside of Graphical, but also your code inside of a GitHub repository. So in this case, I've pulled in a GitHub repository. I have some operations in a graphical document here. And I'm actually syncing with my GitHub repository. So I've made changes, and you can see here that there are going to be some merge conflicts with these different files. And I'm going to go ahead and just say that's fine. This is actually going to push directly from Graphical into GitHub. And for each of those operations, the custom code generator actually knows how to turn that into a very, very high quality React component. So in this case, it's Relay React. And you can see here over on the right that each of those fragments has become a standalone React component. And it's actually nested. So everywhere that we use a fragment inside of one of our queries or one of our fragments, we get an instantiation of that component. So the same exact thing that you would normally do as you are writing your application, the code generation can automate that for you. It can actually build it out much more quickly for you. And not only that, but you'll notice that up here, because I have a variable called created by, that becomes a nice little form. And so by the end of this 10-minute, 30-minute video, I've gone from nothing, absolutely basically no code. I've written a couple of queries, and now I have the ability to basically pull in issues from GitHub, render them as a blog post, leave comments, to leave new blog posts, to subscribe to comments. So this is now a real-time application that handles authentication and forms and nested pagination. And again, all the point being that it's not much code. We're not looking to generate lots and lots of code. What we want to do is generate the code that we know you have to write, right? Whenever we look at a GraphQL query, we know that it implies some pagination points. We know that it implies that it needs some variables. And so we know that you are going to have to write code to do that. So we could write the minimum amount of code for you that also implements all of the best practices that we know you should have, or your team thinks you should have, or you think you want to spread for the rest of your company. Kind of like teaching one person in your company to implement the best practices, and then turning that into a robot that everybody gets to use. Similarly, with Netlify Graph, we've really pushed pretty hard on that code generation aspect, where we want to take you from inside of your query, inside of Graphql, and we never want you to ever have to wonder, well, what do I do now? How do I use this thing? So for example, I have a list of all of my operations and fragments and whatnot available inside of my application here. I have one that is going to pull out some information about an NPM package, homepage description, how many times it's been downloaded, that sort of thing. And this is automatically connected to my CLI running locally. So every time I make a modification to that, that's automatically going to translate over into my coding experience. So over here, I've imported Graph, and literally if I just type npm, you'll see that I get this nice autocomplete here. And if I try to run this, I see that I need variables, and I can autocomplete this each step along the way. So maybe we look at React. If I hover over any of these, I get nice description strings. So you can see here that I have an empty query to start from. But if I come in here and I modify this query, and I'll go ahead and update the operation details here. And back in my editor, whenever I hover over this, you can see that my description of this actually translates over. So now anyone who's coming along and trying to figure out what's available inside of the graph that I'm using, they'll have this human level description here, and they get nice type safe autocomplete all the way through. So that's kind of a quick example of the previous state of the art and kind of more current approaches to all of this. But there are some really interesting challenges in here. Kind of zooming out, and some that we've kind of learned to at least articulate so that we're aware of them whenever we're trying to figure out how to approach them. So in particular, there's a big question around how much you want the code to be, one time you generate it and you eject and the user then edits everything from there, or how much of it you want it to be kind of a two-way conversation. So inside of that relay example, I was able to update individual components very, very easily. And then the nesting of those components allowed me to be kind of a much more like individual incision-like update. Whereas whenever we are updating maybe the runtimes or the types, we just want to eject everything. On top of that, there are a really big limitation of this is what assumptions can CodeGen actually make? And this is really important because code generation ends up becoming this multidimensional challenge where maybe you're using a post versus get method for this component, or you're using this in a serverless function and someone else is using this in a view component. Also, there might be something along the lines of semantic inference that you might want to understand. So for example, knowing that a avatar URL is not just a string, but it's a URL. And not just a URL, but a URL that goes to an image. And then being able to render that differently or generate different bits of code for that versus than you might just do for some generic string. Things for reliable payload delivery. How much can you trust that if you were offline during a subscription, you came back online, that you'll get all of the events that were sent in the meantime? How do you log around that? So there end up being lots and lots of considerations that code generation might have to run into. And so the more assumptions you can make about the platform that's providing the GraphQL API, the more that you can actually automate automate the entire flow for the user. So that they don't have to generate code that might handle 100 different edge cases when you really know they only have to be concerned about this one specific way of approaching things. Which is interesting because it kind of implies that even though GraphQL embodies so much knowledge inside of itself, it's still about maybe 30% of the requirement for how you take that and turn it into either a function or a component that's going to be used. And the other 6% ends up being stuff, like authentication, authorization, mentioned semantic understanding of the schema, runtime aspects of the payload delivery. A lot of it has to do with coding style. So for example, one organization might have different accessibility requirements than another organization, and that needs to be reflected in the code that's generated. And so one of the nice things about Netlify Graph, from my point of view, is that we're able to nail down a significant number of those assumptions whenever we actually write these more generic or more broad-based appeal code generators. So in this case, I have an example of Next.js code sync here. And what it's going to do is I have a mutation over here that is going to update the user profile on GitHub. And although I can generate it as a single function that I can just use like I showed beforehand, most of the time I want to turn this into a React component that the user can upload an image and fill out the form and that sort of thing. And so what we've done here is said, all right, we actually recognize, because you're running our CLI locally, we know that this is a Remix app, that this is a Next.js app, a Create React app, a SvelteKit app, whatever it might be. And then we look and we see, do we have a CodeGen that we know will work best with this and the way that Netlify functions? And so we can really hone in on the user experience and automate so many of those barriers that a user would normally have to transition through themselves. So in this case, the things that we make available are, do you want to use Netlify Graph's API authentication? Do you want to use a post or a get? In this case, I've chosen a get. And simply by running that, you can see over here that it's actually written the files to my hard disk with all of the data coercion, including a component that's going to, a form component that will both handle all the inputs as well as fetching the data, and an API route that handles all the coercion, all the authentication, all of that sort of thing. Now, the thing is, although we are able to make so many assumptions about, or rather, it's in this case, we have knowledge of users' decisions, both in their runtime decisions as well as their framework decisions, their hosting decisions, all sorts of things. So we can actually make the code generator very, very specific to a set of our users. But as I said, it's really important that the users be able to take it further, for that last mile integration where they can say, although they might appreciate that we generate forms for them, they have their own form library. They have their own CSS that they use. They have their own accessibility standards that they use. And so they need to be able to teach the code generation how to do this for their particular team in a very easy way. Because if they can implement that once and then leverage it 1,000 times across all of their coworkers, not only are they going to be much, much happier and they will get to market much faster, but the likelihood of a GraphQL service being successfully adopted inside of that company goes up astronomically. And this is because they know all about their own last mile requirements. So it's really important, and one of the big limitations of the first generation of GraphQL CodeGen is that it was very difficult to extend it. So we've really tried to make it so that it's much, much easier to do that. And the thing is, this can be done in lots of different ways. So this can be done either at runtime or at build time. And like so much work can actually be automated. So for example, we use this inside of Netlify to actually, we dog food this quite heavily. So in particular, we know how to take a query like this, so just a normal GraphQL query, nothing special with it, and we turn it into a beautiful form that's very, very interactive like this. And the reason we do this is because I was writing a lot of forms and they were not coming out anywhere near the way that they should be. Like they should not be shown to users in the state that they were, is a gentler way of saying what was told to me. So we sat down with our designers who are fantastic, and we said, let's make a form that works really, really well. And I'm going to work on consuming that GraphQL CodeGen and just dynamically generating one of these forms. So now wherever we are, we can just, we have a list of examples. You can just pop in a GraphQL query and you get a form like this out. And let me show you a little bit about what that looks like. So if I come over here, I have lots and lots of examples. So every service has some examples. So maybe, for example, I want to know how to download the contents of a file from GitHub. I can just come here into the example. You can see that the suggestions here are preloaded over here. I get a nice description of what this is about. And as I start filling this out, so you'll notice that it highlights exactly where we are inside of here and says, so maybe I want Sgrove blog, and I want to get the README for that. And as I do this, you can see it's actually highlighting and telling me what I'm actually modifying. So we use this both internally to generate very nice forms, but also to teach our users and our teammates who are not so familiar with GraphQL what's actually going on in that GraphQL query in a way that feels very much more human. There's a form and highlights and animations that kind of draw your attention so you know exactly how the actions that you're taking are actually informing the data that you're going to get back. And so if I turn that really back, Netlify CLI, I'll go ahead and continue. And if I run that again, you can see I've actually downloaded the content of this file directly from GitHub, which is an amazing thing to be able to have inside of my application. There are so many applications where I want to do this. So it's pretty nice to have this query. I can come in here, save it, boom, it's now part of my library, and that's going to be available for me in my VS Code, just like we saw earlier with nice autocomplete, nice description, everything. Wrapping up here, there's lots of future work that could be really, really interesting. Most of the code that we generate right now is meant in an injection sort of way. It's still very customized, but it's meant to do the bare minimum of what we know you're going to need, or what your design team or your accessibility team or your security team know you're going to need. And then once you've generated it, it's really there for you to add all the flair and the nuance that you want it to have. What would be really interesting is to actually work with a code mod toolkit to provide a kind of two-way understanding, so that going even further than the relay demo earlier, where as you were modifying your code, we could maybe extract some of the GraphQL operations and modify the representation of them inside of our tooling, and then generate something that followed those modifications that you had. Yeah, I think that's it for today. Appreciate you listening to this. Yeah, again, Sean Grove, I'm principal architect on Netlify Graph. I love developer tooling, very, very near and dear to my heart, and always happy to talk about this stuff. So if you're interested, please hit me up. Cheers.